Mark Jensen loved his house, but he adored his tree. It wasn't just any tree. It was a venerable northern red oak, a titan that had stood guard over his property for well over a century, its sprawling branches forming a living canopy that dappled his lawn with shifting patterns of light and shadow. In spring, it burst forth in a riot of green, offering cool respite from the summer sun. In autumn, its leaves blazed in fiery reds and oranges, a spectacle that drew admiration from passers-by. For Mark, the tree was a landmark, a source of peace, and a silent, majestic sentinel in a world that often felt too fast, too loud. His house, a charming two-story colonial with a welcoming front porch, sat comfortably on a generous half-acre lot in Willow Creek Estates, a meticulously maintained suburban haven. Willow Creek was the kind of place where lawns were always manicured, mailboxes matched, and not a single rogue dandelion dared to show its face. This wasn't by accident. It was thanks, in no small part, to the tireless, some might say tyrannical efforts of the Homeowners Association, and more specifically, its iron-fisted president, Karen Albright. Karen was the embodiment of Willow Creek's pristine aesthetic. Her own home, directly across the street from Mark's, was a testament to architectural conformity and horticultural perfection. Not a blade of grass was out of place, not a shrub untrimmed. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper opinions, her perfectly coiffed blonde bob never seeming to fall out of place, much like her control over the community's bylaws. She ran the HOA meetings with the efficiency of a corporate CEO and the unyielding authority of a drill sergeant. Residents joked about her Karen-o-meter for measuring compliance, but few dared to cross her. Mark, a quiet software engineer who preferred coding to committee meetings, had, for the most part, managed to fly under Karen's radar. He kept his lawn tidy, paid his dues on time, and his only major deviation from the norm was his magnificent oak. It was, in fact, the very reason he'd bought the house 5 years ago. He'd envisioned reading under its shade, watching his future kids climb its sturdy limbs, and simply enjoying its ancient grandeur. The oak wasn't just a tree, it was the heart of his home. The first hint of trouble had come subtly, a brief mention in the HOA's quarterly newsletter about overgrown and potentially hazardous foliage affecting property values and common area views. Mark had dismissed it. His tree was healthy, robust, and had been inspected annually by a certified arborist. There were no dead limbs, no signs of disease. It was a picture of vitality. Then came the formal letter, a stark white envelope bearing the HOA's crisp, no-nonsense logo. Inside, the language was polite but firm, citing Article 4, Section 3B of the Willow Creek Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions CC&Rs. All trees and landscaping on private property shall be maintained in a manner that does not obstruct views of common areas or neighboring properties or pose a safety risk as determined by the HOA Board of Directors. It went on to state that his oak, due to its excessive size and proximity to the street, was deemed to be potentially encroaching upon the common visual aesthetic and creating an imbalance in the streetscape. Mark reread the letter, a knot forming in his stomach. Excessive size? Imbalance? The tree was a natural wonder, not a violation. He looked out his window at the oak, its leaves rustling gently in the afternoon breeze, completely oblivious to the bureaucratic assault it was facing. He knew instinctively who was behind this. Karen Albright. The oak, in its wild, magnificent glory, was simply too untamed for her perfectly manicured world. And it was right across the street, a constant, defiant presence in her peripheral vision. He sighed, pushing away from his computer. This was going to be a battle, and Mark Jensen, while preferring peace, wasn't about to let his ancient guardian fall without a fight. Mark stared at the HOA letter, then back at his tree. Excessive size, he scoffed. Was the natural world now subject to Karen Albright's exacting standards? He pulled up the Willow Creek Estates CC and Rs on his computer, scanning the dense legalese. Article 4, Section 3B was indeed there, but the wording was vague, subjective. Obstruct views, safety risk, common visual aesthetic. It gave the HOA board immense discretionary power, especially with Karen at the helm. His first impulse was to confront Karen directly, but he knew that would be like walking into a buzzsaw. Instead, he opted for a more diplomatic approach. He called the arborist who had inspected his tree annually, a genial man named Sam from Rooted and Ready Tree Services. Sam arrived the next day, a clipboard in hand, and spent an hour examining the oak. "Mark, this tree is a marvel," Sam declared, tapping the sturdy trunk. "It's healthy, well-rooted, and structurally sound. No disease, no significant deadwood. It poses zero safety risk." He provided Mark with a detailed report, complete with diagrams and photos, confirming the oak's robust health and offering suggestions for minor, routine maintenance. Certainly nothing that would diminish its grandeur or unbalance the streetscape. Armed with Sam's report, Mark requested a meeting with the HOA board. He prepared a concise presentation highlighting the tree's health benefits, shade, oxygen, wildlife habitat, its historical significance to the property, and the professional opinion of the arborist. He even printed out photos of other large mature trees in more prestigious neighborhoods, arguing that such trees enhanced property values rather than detracting from them. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room filled with beige furniture. Karen sat at the head of the long table, flanked by two other board members. Mrs. Henderson, a quiet, perpetually nervous woman who seemed to nod at whatever Karen said, and Mr. Davies, a retired accountant who rarely spoke above a murmur. Mark presented his case calmly, rationally. He explained Sam's findings, emphasizing that the tree was healthy and not a hazard. "I understand the desire for aesthetic harmony," Mark concluded, "but this tree has been a part of Willow Creek for over 100 years. It's an asset, not an eyesore. It truly doesn't obstruct any views or pose a risk." Karen listened, her expression unreadable. When Mark finished, she cleared her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Jensen, for your presentation. We appreciate your passion for your foliage." The subtle disdain in her voice was unmistakable. "However," she continued, "the board has received multiple comments regarding the imposing nature of this particular tree. While your arborist attests to its health, the sheer size, especially its lateral spread over public easements and towards neighboring properties, is a concern. We are not questioning its health, merely its proportionality within the established aesthetic guidelines of our community." She then pulled out her own evidence, a series of photos. One was a wide shot of Mark's house, zoomed in just enough to make the oak appear to dominate the entire frame, casting a disproportionately large shadow. Another showed a street view, carefully angled to make it seem as though the oak's branches were indeed encroaching on the sidewalk and obscuring a stop sign, which they weren't. "As you can see," Karen declared, tapping a photo with a perfectly manicured finger. The tree creates an undeniable visual barrier. Furthermore, the constant shedding of leaves and acorns creates additional maintenance burdens for the common areas and adjacent properties. She didn't mention that it was autumn and all trees shed leaves, or that his lot was largely self-contained. Mrs. Henderson nodded sagely. Mr. Davies mumbled something unintelligible. "The board's decision," Karen stated, her voice rising slightly, "is final. Your tree, while healthy, exceeds the acceptable size and spread for its location as per our CC and Rs. You have two options: either significantly prune the tree, reducing its canopy by at least 30%, or, if that is not feasible for an arborist to do without harming the tree, remove it entirely. You have 30 days to comply. Failure to do so will result in fines as outlined in Article 6, Section 2A, escalating weekly." Mark felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. 30%? That wasn't pruning. That was mutilation. It would destroy the tree's natural shape, its very essence. It was clear that Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She was interested in control. The arborist's report, his careful arguments, his genuine love for the tree, none of it mattered. He was a piece of her perfectly manicured puzzle that simply didn't fit. The next few weeks were a blur of helpless fury for Mark. He consulted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, hoping for some legal loophole, some recourse against Karen's autocratic decree. The lawyer, a weary-looking man named Mr. Thompson, listened patiently, nodding occasionally. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Jensen," Thompson said, steepling his fingers. "But HOA bylaws, especially in well-established communities like Willow Creek, are notoriously robust. They're designed to give the board significant power over aesthetic consistency. Unless you can prove malice, discrimination, or a clear violation of state law, your options are limited. The visual aesthetic clause is subjective, yes, but courts generally defer to the board's interpretation as long as it's not entirely arbitrary or applied inconsistently. And it sounds like Ms. Albright is meticulous about consistency, however draconian it might seem." Mark's heart sank. "So there's nothing? They can just order me to mutilate my property?" Thompson shrugged sympathetically. "They can, if it falls within the scope of the CC and Rs you agreed to when you bought the house. Fighting this would be a long, expensive uphill battle, likely ending in compromise or worse, you still losing and footing significant legal bills. Your best bet might be to negotiate a less severe pruning, but it seems that ship has sailed." The ship had indeed sailed. Karen had made that clear. She had sent a follow-up letter, even colder than the first, reminding him of the impending fines if he failed to comply by the deadline. Mark knew he couldn't afford a protracted legal fight, nor could he stomach the thought of his beautiful oak being butchered. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with it, then finally, with a heavy heart, made the call to Sam's Rooted and Ready Tree Services. He requested removal. It felt like signing a death warrant. The morning the crew arrived was crisp and clear, a perverse irony to the stark deed about to be done. Mark watched from his living room window as the truck pulled up, its machinery glinting in the early sun. Two burly men in hard hats emerged, carrying chainsaws and ropes. He felt a physical ache in his chest. This wasn't just about a tree, it was about an intrusion, a violation of his sanctuary, a forced capitulation. He retreated to his kitchen, unable to watch the inevitable. The rhythmic growl of chainsaws soon filled the air, cutting through the peaceful morning quiet. Each whine and roar was a fresh stab to his gut. He heard the sharp, tearing sound of branches snapping, then the heavy thud as they hit the ground. It went on for hours, a brutal, relentless soundtrack to his defeat. When the silence finally fell, heavy and unnatural, Mark forced himself to look. Where the majestic oak had stood for over a century, there was now a gaping, barren patch of churned earth. A freshly ground stump, raw and white, was the only evidence of its former glory. The canopy that had once embraced his house was gone, replaced by an unsettling, stark emptiness. The sun, once filtered, now beat down relentlessly on his porch. His house felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a vital organ had been ripped from its core. The entire street seemed to breathe differently, colder, less alive. He walked outside, slowly approaching the desecrated spot. He knelt, touching the rough, splintered edge of the stump. It was a gravestone for his guardian. That afternoon, Karen Albright walked her manicured poodle, Fifi, directly across the street from Mark's house. She paused, surveying the now unobstructed view, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. She didn't look at Mark, who was still standing by the stump, but her gaze lingered on the empty space where the oak had been, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. Something snapped inside Mark. The grief curdled into a cold, hard rage. He marched across the street, his hands clenched into fists. "Are you happy now, Karen?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You got what you wanted. You butchered a 100-year-old tree for your visual aesthetic." Karen turned slowly, her expression shifting to one of feigned surprise, then a condescending pity. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, "there's no need for such dramatics. The board made a decision based on the CC&Rs. We are simply maintaining the integrity of Willow Creek Estates. It's for the good of the community, and frankly, your property value will likely benefit from the improved curb appeal." "Improved curb appeal?" Mark laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You call that improved? You destroyed it. You enjoy destroying things, don't you, Karen? You enjoy having power over people's lives." She straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone, Mr. Jensen. I perform my duties as president for the benefit of all residents, unlike some who seem to believe they are above the rules." She then turned her back, Fifi's leash, and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, simmering in a potent cocktail of grief, rage, and a crushing sense of powerlessness. As he walked back to his now exposed house, a new thought, dark and resolute, began to form. He couldn't fight her with rules or lawyers. Karen Albright had played by her rules, and she had won this round. But there were other games, and Mark Jensen was about to learn how to play them. The weeks following the oak's demise were bleak. Mark felt a hollow ache in his chest, a constant reminder of the void where his tree had been. He'd walk into his living room, expecting to see the dappled light of the canopy, only to be met by a harsh, unfiltered glare. The silence where the rustling leaves had once been was deafening. He considered putting up a privacy fence, but what was the point? Karen had claimed her victory, and the raw, exposed stump in his yard was her monument. His anger, initially a searing heat, had begun to cool into a hard, metallic resolve. He replayed the confrontation with Karen over and over in his mind, her smug face, her dismissive words. The powerlessness he'd felt in that moment was a bitter taste he vowed never to experience again. Lawyers had failed him. Direct appeals had failed him. Playing by her rules had only led to his defeat. But what if he didn't play by her rules, but by the rules better than her? What if he could twist the very system she so meticulously upheld to his own advantage? The idea was a faint flicker at first, then a slow burn that grew into a steady flame. He wouldn't resort to vandalism or illegal acts. That was Karen's game, disguised as community improvement. Mark would hit her where it hurt most: her pristine sensibilities, her perfect view, her absolute control. He started spending evenings poring over the Willow Creek Estate's online property maps, something he'd never done before. He traced property lines, checked zoning regulations, and cross-referenced public records. He wasn't looking for a new house, he was looking for an opportunity, a weakness in Karen's meticulously crafted world. His gaze kept returning to the properties directly bordering Karen Albright's backyard. Her house sat on a generous lot, backing onto what appeared to be a stretch of untouched woodland, a green buffer she likely cherished. But upon closer inspection of the detailed cadastral maps, Mark noticed something peculiar. Directly behind Karen's property, sandwiched between the woodland, which was largely an undeveloped strip of land owned by the community association, and a quiet, dead-end service road, was a narrow, irregularly shaped parcel. It was small, certainly not big enough for a conventional house, and heavily overgrown. It was listed as Lot 17B, undeveloped land, and remarkably, it was privately owned, not by the HOA. He zoomed in. The lot seemed almost forgotten, a neglected sliver of land that no one had ever bothered to develop. It was densely wooded, sloping slightly, and technically accessible only from the rarely used service road. Its zoning, according to the county's public records, was R1, residential. This meant, theoretically, it could be built on, albeit with significant challenges due to its size and shape. A jolt went through Mark. This wasn't just a piece of land, it was a tactical weapon. Karen's backyard, which overlooked this very strip, was her sanctuary. He remembered her meticulous rose garden, her expensive patio furniture, the way she would often sit out there with a glass of wine, gazing at her perfectly manicured domain. This lot was directly behind her. He spent days researching the property. He discovered it belonged to an elderly couple who had moved out of state years ago and had simply held on to it as an investment, likely forgetting its existence. It was listed for sale by a local real estate agent, but it had been on the market for ages, deemed unbuildable by most conventional buyers. The price was surprisingly low, reflecting its perceived lack of utility. But for Mark, it had immeasurable utility. It wasn't about building a dream home, it was about building a strategic nuisance. A quiet, insidious joy began to bubble within him. The grief over his oak tree didn't vanish, but it transformed, channeling itself into this new, potent purpose. Karen Albright had taken something precious from him. Now he would introduce a permanent, visible disruption into her perfect world. He imagined the possibilities, the look on her face when she realized what he had done. It wouldn't be a direct confrontation, but a subtle, persistent annoyance, perfectly within the letter of the law. He found himself smiling for the first time in weeks, a dark, determined smile. The game had just begun. The real estate listing for Lot 17B was buried deep within the brokerage's website, almost an afterthought. Mark clicked on it, noting the sparse details. Undeveloped residential parcel, unique opportunity. The satellite image showed a dense tangle of trees and undergrowth, indistinguishable from the community's natural preserve next to it. No one in their right mind looking for a family home would consider it perfect. He called the listed agent a chipper woman named Brenda, whose voice instantly conveyed a mixture of surprise and skepticism at his interest. Lot 17B? Oh yes, that one, she said, a slight pause betraying her confusion. It's been on the market for quite some time. The previous owners just want to offload it. It's challenging, as you can imagine. Very narrow, and it has that interesting grade to it. I understand it's not conventional, Mark replied, his voice carefully neutral. But I'm interested in the long-term potential. I'm thinking of it more as an investment, perhaps for future recreational use. He deliberately avoided mentioning Willow Creek Estates or his own address. He was buying the lot as Mark Jensen, an individual, not as a resident of the HOA. The less Brenda knew, the better. Brenda, clearly eager to move a stagnant listing, quickly arranged a showing. Mark walked the property alone, pushing through thorny bushes and overgrown vines. It was indeed challenging. The ground sloped away from Karen's backyard, meaning anything built there would need significant foundation work or would naturally sit lower. But the key was its direct adjacency. He stood on the highest point, looking straight into Karen's meticulously manicured yard, feeling a chill run down his spine. This was it, the precise point of impact. The negotiations were swift. The elderly owners were keen to sell, and Mark's lowball offer was accepted with surprising alacrity. They simply wanted it off their books. He chose a discreet title company outside of Willow Creek, ensuring no local gossip would inadvertently leak. He even considered creating an LLC for the purchase, but decided against it. The added complexity wasn't worth the marginal increase in anonymity, and besides, he wanted Karen to eventually know it was him. Just not yet. The closing day was uneventful. A quiet transaction in a sterile office. As he signed the final documents, transferring ownership of the neglected sliver of land to his name, a profound sense of triumph washed over him. It wasn't loud or boisterous, it was a deep, quiet satisfaction. He felt a shift in his power dynamic with Karen. Before, he was a victim, at the mercy of her rules. Now he was a strategist, moving pieces she didn't even know were on the board. Karen, meanwhile, remained utterly oblivious. She was likely basking in the glory of her pristine streetscape, admiring the improved curb appeal of Mark's now barren front yard. She'd probably forgotten all about the incident, chalking it up as another successful enforcement of her righteous authority. She continued her daily walks with Fifi, her perfectly coiffed head held high, completely unaware that a meticulously crafted plan was now set in motion, lurking just beyond her prized rose bushes. Mark drove home that day, not through Willow Creek Estates, but taking a circuitous route that brought him past the unassuming service road. He slowed as he passed Lot 17B, a dense patch of green hiding its true purpose. He wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a landowner, and a very deliberate one at that. The game was truly on, and he held a card Karen wouldn't see coming until it was too late. The vision of her face when she discovered his silent acquisition filled him with a potent, exhilarating sense of anticipation. With Lot 17B securely in his name, Mark spent the next few weeks meticulously planning his next move. The key was to be perfectly legal, undeniably compliant with county ordinances and yet utterly infuriatingly disruptive to Karen Albright. He consulted county zoning maps, building codes, and even took a course in basic carpentry and shed construction online. His software engineering mind, accustomed to complex problem solving, found a new perverse satisfaction in this project. He decided against anything overtly noisy or smelly. That might give Karen a legitimate complaint that could cross municipal lines. His aim was visual blight and subtle psychological warfare. After much deliberation, he settled on the most impactful yet permissible option for the narrow sloped lot, a multi-tiered rustic observation deck with an attached, slightly oversized storage shed. It would be framed from untreated, rough-sawn lumber, designed to weather naturally to a muted, slightly weathered gray. And crucially, it would be positioned at the highest point of the lot, directly behind Karen's prize-winning rose garden. He submitted his plans to the county for a building permit, meticulously detailing everything, ensuring every dimension, setback, and structural element was within the generous R1 zoning allowances for accessory structures. He even included plans for a small unpaved gravel path leading from the service road. The county, dealing with far more complex projects, approved it without a hitch. The lot was outside the Willow Creek Estates HOA's direct jurisdiction, a fact Mark savored. They could try to levy fines on his property within the estates, but this new parcel was governed by different rules entirely. Mark started work quietly, mostly on weekends, driving an older pickup truck he borrowed from a friend, parking it inconspicuously on the service road. He cleared a small section of brush, just enough for access. The sounds were minimal. The occasional whir of a power saw, the thud of lumber. For days, Karen remained blissfully unaware. She was too busy scrutinizing his grass length or inspecting the cleanliness of his driveway. The construction of the shed framework began first, a skeletal outline rising from the dense foliage. Then came the deck, its rough posts steadily gaining height. Mark deliberately chose not to paint or stain the wood, allowing it to remain raw and utilitarian. He installed a simple galvanized metal roof that would reflect the sun with a dull gleam. When the main structure of the shed was up, he then built the upper observation platform, deliberately making the railing slightly higher than necessary, just enough to give a clear view over Karen's fence. One Saturday afternoon, as Mark was hammering the last few planks onto the deck, he heard a sharp gasp. He looked up. Karen Albright was standing in her backyard, a watering can dangling from her hand, her mouth agape. Her eyes, usually narrowed in critical assessment, were wide with disbelief, fixed on the crude, unvarnished structure rising unapologetically behind her prize-winning rose bushes. The new, stark lumber stood in stark contrast to her perfectly manicured lawn and the pristine white of her back patio. She dropped the watering can, splashing water onto her immaculately white gardening shoes. "What in the name of... What is that monstrosity?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the divide. She then spotted Mark, clad in work clothes, a hammer in his hand. Her eyes narrowed, then widened again as recognition dawned, followed by a furious, indignant flush. "Jensen! You?" she practically screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "What are you doing back there? You can't just build that behind my house. This is an outrage. This is an HOA violation." Mark straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He leaned casually on his hammer, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "Good afternoon, Karen," he said, his voice calm, almost cordial. "As you can see, I'm just developing my property. Lot 17B, I believe it's called. My property." He gestured expansively at the structure, then at the boundary line. "It's all perfectly legal. Got all my county permits. R1 zoning, you know." He made sure to emphasize county and my property, a subtle jab at her HOA authority. Karen stomped towards the back fence, her face a mask of incandescent fury. "Your property? What do you mean your property? That's common area. It's undeveloped woodland." "Not entirely, Karen," Mark corrected mildly, enjoying her unraveling. "A small section, Lot 17B, has always been privately owned, and now it's owned by me. So welcome to the neighborhood. You've got a new backdoor neighbor." He could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she processed this information, the color draining from her face. Her perfectly ordered world was suddenly, irrevocably out of alignment. Karen Albright was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially not in front of her prize-winning rose bushes. Her face, usually a mask of controlled composure, was a vibrant shade of crimson. "That's preposterous, Mr. Jensen. This is Willow Creek Estates. Everything within a mile of our community signage is subject to our bylaws." Mark just chuckled softly. "I appreciate your civic pride, Karen, but county lines and property deeds tend to trump HOA aspirations. Lot 17B is zoned R1 by the county. It's outside the defined boundaries of Willow Creek Estates. It's a separate parcel, with its own separate rules. Your CC and ours don't apply." He turned back to his hammering, leaving Karen sputtering at her fence line, utterly speechless for perhaps the first time in her presidency. But her silence was short-lived. The very next day, Mark received an official HOA notice, not about Lot 17B, but about his primary property at 14 Oakwood Lane. It was a cease and desist order for unauthorized construction causing community blight, citing potential structural and aesthetic impacts to adjacent HOA properties and threatening fines of $100 per day if work didn't stop immediately. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to leverage his membership in the HOA against his actions on a separate non-HOA property. Mark just smirked. He had anticipated this. Karen, however, was in full battle mode. She called an emergency HOA board meeting for that very evening, sending out a frantic email blast titled, "Urgent, Threat to Community Integrity." The subject line alone was enough to draw a larger-than-usual crowd, a mix of curious onlookers and loyal Karen supporters. The community clubhouse was abuzz. Karen stood at the podium, her voice trembling with indignation, though Mark suspected it was a carefully cultivated tremor for dramatic effect. "Residents, we face an unprecedented threat to the very fabric of our community," she began, sweeping her gaze across the room. "As you know, our meticulously planned community prides itself on its aesthetic harmony and high property values. Now a rogue element, Mr. Mark Jensen, has purchased a neglected parcel directly behind my home and is erecting an unsanctioned, unsightly structure that clearly violates the spirit, if not the letter, of our beautiful Willow Creek." She used terms like eyesore, slum-like, and blight on our views, painting a vivid picture of a ramshackle shack appearing overnight. She then laid out her argument. While the lot might technically be outside the HOA, Mark was inside the HOA. Therefore, his actions, even on adjacent property, could be deemed detrimental to the common good of Willow Creek and thus fall under some vaguely defined clauses of the CC&Rs regarding maintaining property values and community standards. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he walked to the podium with a calm that belied his simmering satisfaction. He held up a thick manila envelope. "Good evening, everyone. I understand there's some concern about my new project." He held up a copy of his county building permit. "This is my permit from the county for Lot 17B. All approved, all legal, all up to code." He paused, letting that sink in. "Now, Karen mentioned my project violates the spirit of the HOA. I'd like to remind everyone that Lot 17B is not part of Willow Creek Estates. It's a completely separate property, governed by county zoning laws, not HOA bylaws. The structure I am building, a simple storage shed and observation deck, is perfectly legal for that R1 residential zoning." He then held up the cease and desist order. "This document tries to link my activities on Lot 17B to my property here, at 14 Oakwood Lane. It threatens fines. I want to be clear. This is a baseless attempt to exert control over a property that is outside the HOA's jurisdiction. There is no clause in our CC&Rs that allows the HOA to dictate what a resident does on a separately owned, non-HOA parcel, even if it's adjacent. My actions on Lot 17B do not violate any rules pertaining to my property at 14 Oakwood Lane, which I assure you remains fully compliant." A murmur went through the crowd. Some residents, tired of Karen's heavy-handedness, looked intrigued. Others, staunch allies, looked uncertain. Mr. Davies, the quiet board member, finally spoke. "Mark makes a valid point, Karen. We can't fine him for a county-permitted structure on land not part of our association. That's a legal quagmire." Karen's jaw tightened. "But it affects our views. It affects my property values," she hissed, glaring at Mark. "Property values are subjective, Karen," Mark countered smoothly. "And views are not a protected right under our CC&Rs. If they were, my magnificent oak wouldn't have been cut down to improve yours." Karen Albright stormed out of the HOA meeting that night, her face a thundercloud. Mark's calm, factual presentation had blindsided her. He hadn't just diffused her attack, he had turned her own rule-mongering against her, exposing her hypocrisy with the cutting remark about his oak. The quiet muttering among residents afterward had only deepened her humiliation. She hadn't been defeated outright, but she had certainly lost the first round, and the taste was bitter. She wouldn't give up. The next morning, she was on the offensive, not through official channels this time, but through a calculated whisper campaign. She began making rounds, visiting neighbors, telephone in hand, recounting a highly dramatized version of events. "Can you believe the audacity?" she'd lament to Mrs. Henderson, her voice dripping with manufactured distress. "He's putting up some kind of shanty, an unpainted eyesore right on our border. It will bring down all our property values. Our beautiful Willow Creek will become a laughingstock if we let this stand." She'd strategically pull up photos on her phone, carefully cropped to make Mark's rustic shed and deck look like a ramshackle, almost derelict structure. To the more impressionable residents, particularly those who had bought into Willow Creek primarily for its exclusive feel and pristine appearance, her words resonated. They envisioned squatters, unsightly junk piles, and a creeping decay threatening their perfectly manicured lawns. A few residents, genuinely concerned, started murmuring about a petition. But not everyone bought into Karen's narrative. Mark, while continuing to meticulously work on his structure on Lot 17B, adding some perfectly legal, though aesthetically jarring, touches like an oversized, brightly colored wind chime and a collection of salvaged antique garden tools artfully arranged, was also subtly countering. He'd occasionally stop to chat with neighbors who walked by, offering a casual, factual account. "Oh, the shed? Yeah, it's just a storage unit and a little deck for enjoying the back of the property," he'd say, gesturing vaguely towards the trees. "Got all the county permits, of course. Karen's just upset because it's not, well, perfectly landscaped like her backyard. But it's my property, outside the HOA, so she doesn't really have a say." His calm demeanor and logical explanations often disarmed those who had been swayed by Karen's histrionics. Some residents, like Mr. Chang down the street, who had secretly chafed under Karen's relentless nitpicking about his prize-winning, slightly too tall hydrangeas, found a quiet satisfaction in seeing her rattled. "Good for you, Mark," Mr. Chang had mumbled one afternoon, pausing his gardening near Mark's fence. "Someone needs to remind her that harmony means not always getting her own way." Others, however, were caught in the middle. The old guard of Willow Creek, families who had lived there for decades and cherished the community's established order, sided with Karen. They started bringing up old bylaws about maintaining a harmonious neighborhood, attempting to interpret them broadly enough to encompass Mark's new venture. At the next regular HOA meeting, they pushed for a more aggressive stance. "We need to create a new committee," Mrs. Davies declared, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "A committee to review external impacts on community standards. We need to lobby the county. This cannot stand." Karen, seizing the opportunity, introduced a motion for a new external aesthetic review committee, which she conveniently volunteered to chair. The clear intent was to find a backdoor way to pressure Mark or find some obscure violation. They also started talking about nuisance clauses, though defining his perfectly legal structure as a nuisance would be a stretch. Mark attended every meeting, every time armed with printouts of county ordinances, property deeds, and excerpts from past legal precedents regarding HOA overreach. He meticulously documented every complaint and every threatened fine, preparing for a potential legal battle he still hoped to avoid. He'd calmly point out that a committee to review external impacts had no enforcement power over external properties. He'd remind them that nuisance generally implies noise, smell, or danger, none of which applied to his silent, albeit rustic structure. The community atmosphere grew noticeably tense. Residents took sides, or at least watched from a distance, enjoying the unprecedented drama. Mark Jensen, the quiet software engineer, had unwittingly become a symbol of defiance against Karen Albright's iron rule. The oak tree might have been gone, but in its place, a much larger, more enduring conflict was taking root, dividing Willow Creek estates in a way no overgrown bush or mismatched mailbox ever could. Having been thwarted by Mark's meticulous adherence to county code, Karen Albright's frustration curdled into something uglier. The public humiliation at the HOA meeting, coupled with the slow, undeniable progress of Mark's monstrosity behind her house, gnawed at her. Legal avenues through the HOA seemed blocked, but Karen had a deep well of vindictiveness, and she wasn't afraid to draw from it. Her first move was to try and shift the battleground. She began contacting the county planning and zoning department, lodging a series of increasingly elaborate complaints about Lot 17B. She alleged everything from structural instability, it looks like it could collapse at any moment, to environmental violations, he's destroying natural habitat and attracting vermin, to code violations, I'm certain that shed is too tall. Each complaint was a meticulously crafted fabrication designed to trigger an official investigation. Mark, anticipating this, had already prepared. Every time a county inspector showed up, he greeted them with a folder brimming with blueprints, permits, and inspection reports. He'd walk them through the structure, patiently explaining every detail, demonstrating its stability and compliance. Each time, the inspectors left, shrugging politely, confirming that Mark was well within his rights. "Looks perfectly fine, Mr. Jensen," one had said, "much sturdier than some of the stuff we see." The complaints were logged as unfounded, much to Karen's simmering fury. When official complaints failed, Karen resorted to less savory tactics. She began to subtly encourage other residents to complain to the county, urging them to call about Mark's unsightly property. She started planting rumors about Mark in grocery store aisles and at community events. He was unstable, he was building something illicit, he was an outsider trying to disrupt their peaceful community. Then came the petty acts. Mark found his meticulously swept sidewalk inexplicably strewn with garden debris. He received anonymous, threatening notes about his disrespect for community standards. One morning, his carefully cultivated hydrangeas on his front lawn, the ones within HOA jurisdiction, were found pruned down to unsightly stubs far beyond their seasonal trim. He suspected Karen had instructed the HOA landscaping crew to overdo it, a small vindictive act of vandalism. He documented everything, taking photos, noting dates and times, silently building his own case. The most insidious tactic was directed at his professional life. Mark started getting cryptic calls from his employer's HR department, inquiries about community disputes and neighborly conduct that were disturbing the peace. Someone, clearly Karen, was trying to reach out to his workplace, hoping to cause him professional trouble. Mark, ever the strategist, had already taken preemptive measures. He had quietly informed his HR manager about the ongoing HOA dispute, framing it as a case of an overzealous HOA president targeting him for an entirely legal project outside the association's purview. His HR manager, a pragmatic woman, had simply advised him to keep a log and ignore the noise. Through it all, Mark maintained his calm. He knew that reacting emotionally was what Karen wanted. He continued to work on his monstrosity, adding details that, while code-compliant, perfectly embodied rustic defiance. He painted the shed door a vibrant, unapologetic barn red, a stark contrast to the muted tones of Willow Creek. He mounted a large, antique cast-iron weather vane, a rooster, on the highest point of the observation deck, its silhouette visible from Karen's backyard. He even started cultivating a small wild patch of native wildflowers and tall grasses around the base of the structure, letting them grow as nature intended, eschewing the meticulously manicured lawns of the estates. The tension in Willow Creek was palpable. Dinner parties became strained, residents walked faster when passing Mark's house, and the quiet camaraderie of the neighborhood was replaced by an uneasy division. Some residents admired Mark's tenacity, secretly cheering him on. Others quietly resented Karen's relentless pursuit, recognizing it as an abuse of power. Yet another group, caught in the middle, simply wished the whole thing would go away, fearing the escalating conflict would indeed bring down their property values by turning their serene community into a battleground. Karen, however, was past reason. She saw only Mark's continued presence, his unyielding structure, and her eroding authority. She was losing control, and the thought fueled her desperation to new, petty, and increasingly public heights. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it was only a matter of time before one of them would have to yield. Karen Albright's increasingly desperate tactics were having an unintended side effect. They were alienating the very residents she sought to rally. Her incessant complaints to the county had been dismissed. Her whispers about Mark's character were being met with growing skepticism. The petty acts of vandalism were beginning to be noticed, and a few residents had even started quietly talking amongst themselves about an abuse of power. Karen was losing her grip, and she knew it. She decided to make one final grand play, a public spectacle designed to force a decisive outcome. She scheduled a special community-wide meeting titled Preserving the Future of Willow Creek Estates, promising a major announcement regarding the ongoing crisis. She packed the agenda with resolutions aimed squarely at Mark, a motion to censure him for unneighborly conduct, a proposal to establish a stricter architectural review board with broader powers, which she would of course chair, and, most aggressively, a motion to amend the CC&Rs to include language granting the HOA oversight on any adjacent property development deemed detrimental to community interests, with the power to levy substantial fines on primary residences within the HOA for non-compliance. It was a clear retroactive attempt to regain control and financially cripple Mark. The clubhouse was standing room only. Tensions crackled in the air. Karen, dressed impeccably, strode to the podium, a steely glint in her eye. She launched into a passionate, almost theatrical speech about the sanctity of their community, the need for vigilance against outside forces, and the paramount importance of property values. She pointed dramatically at a large poster-sized print of Mark's red-doored shed and weather-beaten deck, strategically angled to look as ungainly as possible. "This residence," she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo, "is what happens when we allow individuals to disregard the collective good. This is a direct threat to our way of life. We must act now, decisively, to protect our homes and our investments." As she finished, a chorus of supportive applause and murmurs of agreement rose from her loyalists. Then, a few dissenting voices could be heard, quickly hushed. Mark, who had been sitting calmly in the back, stood up and approached the podium as soon as Karen seated it. He didn't carry a pile of documents this time. Instead, he carried a single, unassuming photo. "Good evening, everyone," Mark began, his voice calm, cutting through the lingering emotional static. "Karen has spoken passionately about preserving the future and community good. I agree those are important, but let's be clear about what truly threatens our community." He projected the photo onto the screen behind him. It was a striking image, his magnificent northern red oak in full autumnal glory, its leaves a vibrant tapestry of red and gold, casting its majestic shadow over his home. Beside it, he projected a second image, the desolate, stump-filled patch of earth that remained. "Less than a year ago," Mark continued, his voice steady but resonant with restrained emotion, "this was the view from my home. A beautiful century-old tree, healthy and vibrant, providing shade, oxygen, and beauty. It was a cherished part of my property, enhancing my home, a natural landmark in our neighborhood. He paused, letting the contrast sink in. The HOA, under Karen's direction, ordered me to cut it down. Not because it was diseased, not because it was dangerous, but because, in Karen's subjective opinion, its excessive size and imbalance affected her visual aesthetic across the street. He then projected the formal letter from the HOA, the one with the 30-day ultimatum clearly visible. I fought it with facts, with an arborist's report. I appealed to reason. But reason didn't matter. Only Karen's personal preference, disguised as HOA rule enforcement, did. I was forced to destroy something I loved, something irreplaceable, under threat of escalating fines on the home I own here, within this HOA. He then switched the screen back to the photo of his red-doored shed and observation deck. Now Karen calls this monstrosity a threat to our way of life. She wants to amend our CC and Rs retroactively to give the HOA power over properties outside its jurisdiction simply because she dislikes what she sees from her back window. Does that sound like a fair democratic process designed for the collective good? Or does it sound like an attempt to expand absolute power to control every aspect of your lives, even beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek? A significant murmur rippled through the room. Many residents who had only heard Karen's side were now seeing the full picture, the underlying spite and hypocrisy. The contrast between the natural, beautiful tree and the stark, necessary eyesore he was forced to build was stark. I purchased Lot 17B, a fully legal, county-approved residential parcel, precisely because it is outside the HOA's jurisdiction, Mark stated, his voice gaining strength. I built a structure there that is fully compliant with county zoning and building codes. I have endured frivolous complaints to the county, anonymous threats, and even property damage to my front yard, all instigated by our president, because I dared to exist outside her sphere of total control. He looked directly at Karen, whose face had gone pale, her usual composure utterly shattered. You took something from me, Karen. Something I loved and valued, for no legitimate reason other than your personal preference. And because I had no legal recourse, no way to fight you fairly within your rules, I chose to exercise my rights fully on property that is beyond your reach. The shed, the deck, the rooster weather vane. They are all perfectly legal. They are a monument to what happens when unchecked power dictates arbitrary aesthetics. They are a constant reminder that sometimes the only way to protect what's yours is to strategically, legally, and undeniably stand your ground. He turned back to the room. The question before you tonight is not about my shed. It's about whether you want to live in a community governed by clear, equitable rules or by the subjective whims and personal vendettas of one individual. If you pass this amendment, you are giving the HOA, and specifically Karen, the power to control your lives, your properties, and your choices, even on land that isn't part of Willow Creek. Think carefully about the precedent you set. A wave of discussion erupted, louder and more fractured than any before. Mr. Davies, the quiet board member, slowly shook his head, a grim expression on his face. Other board members looked uncomfortable. The tide had definitively turned. Mark hadn't just defended himself. He had publicly exposed Karen's overreach and her underlying motivation, revealing the true nature of her community good campaign. The vote on Karen's proposed amendments was overwhelmingly defeated. Her censure motion didn't even make it to a vote. Karen Albright stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. Her eyes darted around the room, meeting glances of pity, anger, and even outright amusement. The weight of her public defeat pressed down on her. The silence that followed Mark's speech was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of residents slowly beginning to pack up their chairs. Her reign was effectively over, shattered not by defiance, but by a strategically placed shed and the truth. The resounding defeat of Karen Albright's proposals at the special meeting reverberated through Willow Creek Estates like a seismic shock. It wasn't just a rejection of her amendments. It was a public vote of no confidence, a clear statement that the community was tired of her authoritarian rule. The silence that followed Mark's speech was the sound of her power shattering. Within days, the rumors started. Karen, humiliated and enraged, lashed out at the remaining board members, blaming them for her downfall. Mrs. Henderson, emboldened by the shifting tides, finally found her voice and calmly informed Karen that her behavior had become detrimental to the association. Mr. Davies, ever the pragmatist, compiled a list of bylaws Karen had consistently bent or ignored. Faced with a unanimous call for her resignation or the certainty of being voted out in a special election, Karen Albright, for the first time, conceded defeat. Her resignation letter, terse and unapologetic, was delivered to the HOA secretary a week later. With Karen gone, the atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates slowly began to thaw. A new provisional board was elected, comprising more moderate and community-focused residents. The new president, a retired school principal named David Chen, immediately prioritized transparency and open dialogue. The era of the Karenometer was over. As for Karen herself, she became a recluse. Her perfectly manicured yard remained pristine, tended by a service, but she was rarely seen outside. Her daily walks with Fifi ceased. Her home, once the vigilant eye of the community, became a symbol of her spectacular fall. From her back patio, the defiant red door of Mark's shed and the proudly crowing rooster weather vane on his observation deck were a constant, unavoidable reminder of her self-inflicted wound. It wasn't the oak tree, but it was a scar on her perfect landscape, far more enduring than any shade the tree had cast. For Mark, the victory was profound, yet not entirely without a bittersweet aftertaste. The primal satisfaction of seeing Karen's authority crumble was undeniable. He had reclaimed his agency, defended his property, and demonstrated that petty tyranny, even within the confines of an HOA, could be challenged. The shed, once a tool of quiet vengeance, now felt different. It was still rustic, still a deliberate contrast, but its purpose had evolved. It was no longer just a monument of spite, it was a testament to resilience. He kept the shed and the observation deck, occasionally using it to store gardening tools or simply to sit and watch the sunset over the distant tree line. He maintained the wild patch of wildflowers, letting nature take its course, a small, subtle rebellion against the oppressive uniformity that had once defined his street. He never gloated, never spoke ill of Karen. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The empty spot where his beloved oak once stood remained. He considered planting a new one, a smaller sapling, but he decided against it for now. The memory of the magnificent oak would endure, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of the strength he had found in defending himself. Mark Jensen, the quiet software engineer, had not just bought a lot, he had bought back his peace of mind, and in doing so, had inadvertently helped reshape his community. Willow Creek Estates began to find a new balance, one where rules were enforced with reason, not spite. The red-doored shed, visible from Karen's backyard, stood not just as a symbol of personal retribution, but as a subtle, enduring reminder that sometimes the most effective way to challenge arbitrary power is to simply, quietly, and impeccably play by your own rules. The story of the oak tree and the shed would be whispered for years in Willow Creek, a modern-day fable about the power of a single, well-placed act of defiance. And sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, when the wind was just right, Mark could almost hear the triumphant, silent crow of the rooster weather vane, watching over a community that had finally learned to breathe.